So we are in our fifth and final week of this message series we're calling Guardrails. And what is a guardrail? Well, you should know that by now, but in case this is your first time with us over the last 5 weeks, let's get a quick review. A guardrail is a system designed to keep vehicles from straying into dangerous or off-limit areas. We also said that guardrails direct us and protect us. Guardrails are always placed inside the safe zone, not in the danger zone. They're inside the safe zone. We also said that guardrails minimize damage. So a couple of weeks ago, my wife was driving to pick up our daughter from middle school, and you know, school traffic is quite horrible. There's just cars everywhere, on the road, off the road. So where my daughter's school is located, all the roads are fairly narrow. There's not curbs. There's just kind of these narrow roads and then ditches on either side of the road. And so while these middle school parents are waiting for their middle school children to be let out of school, they just pull their cars over to the side of the road, very narrow shoulder of the road, and just wait until the bell rings, you know, let all the kids out. And so my wife, Nikki, she sees a spot ahead on the shoulder of the road, and she thinks to herself, you know, I can fit there. My SUV can fit there. My brand new SUV can fit there on the side of the ditch. And not brand new, but brand new to us. But anyway, so she pulls ahead onto the shoulder with when some random middle school parent comes and taps on her window and says, your back passenger tire is dangling over the ditch in midair. And so she said, oops, you know, but she doesn't know what to do. She can't back up because she's afraid she's just going to back further into the ditch if she does that. And she can't go forward because there's a car parked directly in front of her. And so thankfully, lucky for her, there's some good Samaritans there that are noticing that this crazy lady's trying to drive on three wheels, and so they start to help her. And so they say, okay, so they move the car in front of her, so they get her to move. And so Nikki tries to pull forward, but she can't because she's only getting traction from one wheel, and the other one's just spinning in midair, right? And so another good Samaritan, an older gentleman, he notices some wood by some random neighbor's driveway, so he goes and picks these boards up, and he brings them over and he props them up so that her wheels can get some traction, and then they kind of push on the back of her SUV and get her out of this embarrassing mistake in the ditch that she was about to fall into. Nikki was so embarrassed by it all. She was so thankful for these good Samaritans that were there. And, you know, she was so embarrassed by that story. I'm sure she's very thrilled that I'm telling you all this story today. But I had to tell you this story because it got a very important moral for us today, what we're talking about today, which is this. Nikki needs guardrails. That's the moral of the story for us, right? And as we finish off this message series on guardrails, it's really easy to listen to these messages for the Nickis in our lives. You know, it's easier to listen to them for other people. And to think, you know, Nikki really needs to hear this message today, right? It's easy to listen for other people in mind, but it's difficult to humble ourselves and to listen to these messages for ourselves. So we listen for other people. We often resist the need to build guardrails in our own lives. Remember, we said we like to flirt with the edge rather than to flee from the edge because we think they need guardrails. Other people need guardrails, but not me. I'm different. I'm stronger. I can get a little bit closer to the edge than most people without falling over it. But listen, in the words of Fight Club, chapter 1, verse 1, you are not a beautiful and unique snowflake. Right? You are just like everyone else. When you are tempted, you are weak. It's easy to say that you have the willpower to hold back, but when push comes to shove, you might just find yourself shoved into a ditch. So we resist guardrails because we like to believe that we're stronger than we really are in the face of temptation. But there's actually another reason beyond that we also resist guardrails for ourselves. And here's the other reason we resist them is that guardrails seem to get between you and what you want. Guardrails seem to get between you and what you want. They just put that thing that you want just a little bit further out of reach, make it a little bit more difficult for you to get there. And we want to get what we want. So sometimes we resist this whole idea of guardrails. We don't want financial guardrails. We don't want relational guardrails because we want to have our cake and to eat it too. Guardrails, they just seem to get between what you and what you really want. And we want to get what we want. We like getting what we want. Why should I intentionally keep myself from getting what I want? If I want to spend my money that way, that's up to me. I want to do that. Why can't I spend my money that way? If I want to hang out with those friends, then I should be able to hang out with the friends that I want to hang out with. If I want to hook up with that person, it's my body. I should be able to do what I want with my body, right? We like getting what we want, and guardrails just seem to push us back a little bit further from the things that we really want. They're these like unnecessarily burdensome rules that we put in our lives. And so one of the example of one of those unnecessarily burdensome rules that we've mentioned before in this series is maybe you decide not to have coffee alone with any member of the opposite sex that's not your spouse. I mean, come on, is that really a necessary rule? It seems kind of unnecessarily burdensome if we establish that rule for our personal lives. So let's say that not having coffee with someone beside your spouse is your personal guardrail. You've decided for yourself that that's what you're going to do. So what happens if you get introduced to this new person and she or he invites you to have coffee? And you're like, I know my guardrail is that I'm not supposed to have coffee with any member of the opposite sex that's not my spouse, but I really want to have coffee with this person, right? So shouldn't I do what I want? And besides, it's innocent enough, right? It's just coffee. And so you bump up against this guardrail and you decide, okay, I'm just going to step over this guardrail this time. I'm not going to back away from it. I'm just going to intentionally step over this guardrail. So what happens then if you do that? Well, you just had coffee with somebody, right? You didn't break any law. You didn't commit any sin. No, you just had coffee. No real harm done. No foul. So basically what we just said is there's no real need for guardrails, right? But what happens if you didn't have your guardrail right there? What happens if your guardrail was a little bit closer to the edge than just coffee? So what if your guardrail was, I'll have coffee with someone, but I'm just not going to let them invite me in. I'm not going to let her invite me in. I'm not going to let him invite me in. So after coffee, you find yourself outside of the door of this person's home, and she's inviting you in, and you decide, well, I'll just go in this one time. Right? So what happens then? Well, maybe you just go inside, and then maybe you leave. Still no harm done, right? You don't necessarily need that guardrail, but what if your guardrail is even closer to the edge than that? What if your guardrail is, well, I'm just not going to go upstairs. But you decide to step over that guardrail, and then you all know what happens next. So all of a sudden you see the need for guardrails at that point because you got what you wanted at that point, but you also got all the damage that comes along with it. And you never wanted the damage that came with that temptation. So you don't want guardrails, but you also don't want the kind of damage that comes from not having guardrails. So which do you not want more? So there are these two competing wants in our life. There's what our flesh wants, and then there's what our heart wants. And guardrails protect you from what your flesh wants so that you can be directed towards what your heart wants. You can't have both, though, is the problem. And we try to have both sometimes, but it doesn't work out so well. And we try to have both what our heart wants and what our flesh wants by putting the guardrail as close to the edge as possible. So we say, I'll just have a little bit. I'll just get a little taste. I'll just have a little glimpse of that temptation. I'll just get a little bit closer to the edge. But listen, the closer your guardrail is to the edge, the greater the temptation to cross it. The closer your guardrail is to the edge, the greater your temptation is to cross it. And once you cross it, your heart loses and your flesh wins. Once you cross, the damage goes from this minimal guardrail, fender bender type damage to over the cliff, total the car, ruin your life kind of damage. You go from flesh wound to shot through the heart wound. The closer your guardrail is to the edge, the greater the temptation is to cross it. I mean, if you think about that, we already know that's true, right? Which is the bigger temptation for you? To have coffee with someone or to be invited into someone's room? I mean, one has a greater temptation than the other. Coffee is not that big of a deal because it's so much farther away from the edge. And the closer your guardrail is to the edge, the greater the temptation to cross it. It's a lot more tempting and it's a whole lot easier, think about it, to go ahead and slide into home plate once you've already rounded third base. But you would never even think about sliding into home plate if you'd never rounded first base in the first place, right? So you find that guardrail. Where is your guardrail? The closer it is to the edge, the greater the temptation to cross it. So I know guardrails sometimes make it seem like we're making life unnecessarily difficult. Putting all these rules inside the safe zone instead of in the danger zone, when there's nothing really wrong or sinful about these things that we're telling ourselves not to do? Isn't that making life just unnecessarily difficult for us? But listen, not having guardrails makes temptation unnecessarily difficult. As unnecessarily difficult as guardrails might seem to make life, getting closer and closer to the edge of temptation is actually the greater difficulty. I prefer to pray the prayer like Jesus taught us to pray in Matthew chapter 6, verse 13, when he says, "Lead us not into temptation." See, in other words, forget about praying for the power to resist the temptation once we're in it. Right? Temptation is just too unnecessarily difficult for us to resist. So no, I'm going to pray instead to just never go into it, to never be in the temptation. I don't even want to be in the situation where I am tempted. Lead me not into temptation so I don't have to resist evil. Let me set up that guardrail a little bit farther back so that I'm not tempted. Because I know the weakness of my own flesh. I know the hunger of my stomach, the pursuit of my appetites. They're often stronger than the desires of my heart. And if you can just stay just a little bit farther back from temptation, put that guardrail just a little further from the edge, your life will be so much easier. It will be easier to get what you really want in life. Because what is temptation? Temptation is this draw or this pull towards what our flesh wants, not towards what our heart wants. So do you know what's tempting for my flesh? Coffee-flavored ice cream. It's quite tempting for me. My favorite is something called Java chocolate chunk. So my flesh, my stomach, is tempted by ice cream. But is that good for my heart? Well, not really in more ways than one, right? So let's just say that I decide I want to live a healthy life. And so what kind of guardrail do I need to put up to prevent me from overindulging in Java chocolate chunk? So maybe I could set up this guardrail. I could say, all right, use a bowl. That's my guardrail. So I won't allow myself to just eat it straight out of the carton. So I must put it in a bowl first. But still that could be tempting because, how big of a bowl? And how big of a serving inside that bowl? So maybe I'll set the guardrail just a little further back from that and say, okay, well, maybe I'll only allow 2 scoops in the bowl. Maybe that's my guardrail, 2 scoops. But then that's still a little tempting. How many times a day can I have 2 scoops? How many times a week can I have 2 scoops? Whatever the situation is. And so maybe that's still a little bit tempting. So I push it back just a little bit farther and I say, okay, I'm only going to eat it on the weekend. Okay? But it's still tempting me, calling to me every night of the week from my freezer. So then maybe I need to move the guardrail just a little bit farther back from that. Maybe the guardrail is don't even walk down the frozen dessert aisle at the grocery store. That's it. Because if you don't put it in your buggy, it won't go into your belly. That's not freezer, people. That doesn't go. Don't put it in your buggy. It doesn't go into your belly, right? So now this ice cream guardrail reminds me of another food guardrail found in the Bible. It's found in the book of Daniel. It's in the story about Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You probably heard those names before. All Jewish teenage boys who get exiled from their home country, and they get forced to live in this place called Babylon. And according to Daniel chapter 1, verse 4 and 5, the king of Babylon had the goal of training these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. He says in verse 5, they were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Now, part of the plan for this king, it says in verse 5, is that it says the king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. Now, on the surface, this sounds like a pretty sweet deal for these teenage boys. They get free food. They get to be in the royal service. They get free schooling to do that. But here's the thing about the king's food. I mean, to everyone else, this looked like a great deal. It would be delicious. Who wouldn't want to eat the king's food? But for a Jewish young man, this presented a few problems. Number one, he wasn't sure if the food was kosher and if it was prepared in a way that it was acceptable to his religious beliefs and to his conscience and personal convictions. Second problem was that the food was often dedicated to foreign gods, and so participating in eating it would be the equivalent of acknowledging that these other gods exist and almost making an offering towards them. But third, the larger issue, the heart of the matter for them, was that if time and time again they came to the king's table and they ate the king's food 3 times a day, they would 3 times a day be doing something that they didn't really want to do in their hearts. Daniel knew that maybe he wanted to eat the food. Maybe his flesh was hungry and tempted by the food. But he knew in his heart that the kind of person that eats that food is not the kind of person that he wanted to be. The kind of person that eats that food is a Babylonian who worships different gods. And that's not the person that he wants to be. So yes, his flesh and his stomach might be filled, but his heart would become more and more empty. He knew that little by little, his identity as a Jewish young man would erode with every bite that he took. And slowly over time, it never happens fast, it's always slowly over time, it's always a slow fade. Slowly over time, his participation in these Babylonian things would destroy his Jewish heart. So what did Daniel do? He built a guardrail. Doesn't say that he built a guardrail, but that's what he did. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, it says, "But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king." And so what happens in the story is that he asks the chief official to serve him and his friends only vegetables and water. And so listen to that carefully, because it's not just that he chose not to eat anything but vegetables and water, but he requested that he not even be served it. Because he knew that if it was served to him, if it was just sat there right in front of him at the table, that he would be even more tempted to just take a bite. Right? Just one bite, just one meal's not going to hurt you. Just one day's eating won't hurt you. The closer the guardrail is to the edge, the greater the temptation to cross it. So do you want to have to fight through greater temptation? Or would you rather just avoid the temptation altogether? Do you want an easier life or a hard life? I mean, have you ever known anyone that looked back on the course of their life and they said, I wish my life had been just a little bit more difficult? Yeah, we live in such a way, though. We live in such a way today where it's like we try to make our lives more difficult for ourselves. No one has ever been on their deathbed and thought, gosh, if I had just gotten just a little bit closer to destroying my marriage, if I had just flirted a little bit more on the edge of financial ruin and bankruptcy, I wish I just pushed a little bit more on my drinking habit, gotten a little bit closer to completely destroying every relationship in my family. No one ever wishes for that sort of thing at the end of their life. So when we ask these questions about the end of our life and what we really want from the perspective of the ends of our lives, we can see what is really most important to our hearts now. When our heart is about to stop beating, that's when it becomes clear to us what has kept it beating all along. And what keeps your heart beating? What's most important to you in your heart of hearts? What you care most about, what you really want, is not the stuff that tempts you. It's not. Temptation is what our flesh wants, not what our heart wants. But your heart won't get what it wants if you keep giving your flesh what it wants. If you keep feeding your flesh, feeding your stomach, your appetite will keep growing and growing, and your heart will keep starving and starving. So listen to the advice of King Solomon, who gives us some advice about guardrails and how to guard our hearts in the book of Proverbs, chapter 4, verse 10. My child, listen to me and do as I say, and you will have a long and good life. I will teach you wisdom's ways and lead you in straight paths. When you walk, you won't be held back. When you run, you won't stumble. See, it's not to hold you back that we establish these kinds of guardrails in our life. It's not to hold you back from what you really want. It's not to make you stumble more often, but it's to keep you from stumbling, to make your path straight towards the goal that you really want for your own life. Verse 13, take hold of my instructions and don't let them go. Guard them, for they are the key to life. Don't do as the wicked do, and don't follow the path of evildoers. Don't even think about it. Don't go that way. Turn away and keep moving. That's advice for when we bump up into one of these guardrails. Just turn away and keep moving. Verse 20 says, my child, pay attention to what I say. Listen carefully to my words. Don't lose sight of them. Let them penetrate deep into your heart, for they bring life to those who find them and healing to their whole body. Guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. Avoid all perverse talk. Stay away from corrupt speech. Look straight ahead and fix your eyes on what lies before you. Mark out a straight path for your feet. Stay on the safe path. Don't get sidetracked. Keep your feet from following evil. So these guardrails, they guard you from the temptation of your flesh, the temptations that feed your stomach but starve your hearts. These guardrails guard you from the temptation of your flesh so that your heart can be filled. So let's have a heart-to-heart. What is it that your heart really wants? Now, what does your flesh want? Now, what are you itching to buy? Not what are you tempting to try? Not what are you envious of? But what does your heart really want? And can we just pause for a moment and marvel at the story of Daniel and these teenage boys, these teenagers who have the self-awareness and the maturity to make this kind of mature resolution, this wise resolution to distinguish from what their flesh wants and what their hearts want. That tells me if teenagers can do this sort of thing, you can do it. You are mature enough to have this moment of self-awareness, to be honest with yourself about what your heart really wants. So what does your heart really want in life? When it comes to your friendships, what does your heart really want in your friendships? When it comes to your finances, what does your heart really want in your finances? You know, I really doubt that your heart cares that much about the latest clothing trends. It just doesn't. I mean, that's a desire of the flesh, isn't it? Because you're literally covering your flesh with clothes. I mean, I really doubt that what your heart really cares the most about is the perfectly styled HGTV home. You know? I really doubt that your heart cares about the latest toys, the latest technology, none of which you'll remember on your deathbed. None of that stuff is bad or wrong. You can have all the technology and toys that you want. That's fine. But you know what we'll think of the latest iPhone, the 2017 iPhone, when we're all on our deathbeds? Nothing. We will think nothing about it. And if we do think anything about it at all, it'll probably be to make fun of it like we make fun of cassette tapes today or Walkmans or something. We'll think, oh, remember when the iPhone was cool? This stuff that your heart wants when it comes to your finances, it's not stuff. It's not bad to have nice things. Just don't let your temptation for nice things starve your heart from the greater things, the more satisfying, fulfilling uses of your money. Because I just really doubt that you'll ever get to the end of your life and you'll say, oh, I'm so glad that I spent all my money on myself. I'm so glad that I was in debt for so long. You know, I really doubt that in your heart, that's the way you want to use your money. Instead, I'm pretty confident that what your heart wants is to be generous with your money. Is your heart wants to help more people with your money when you can. Your heart wants you to give generously, not to be frivolous in your spending. What does your heart really want? And when it comes to your relationships, what does your heart really want in your relationships? I really doubt that what your heart wants, that your heart wants what your flesh is tempted toward. I really doubt that other woman or that other man is going to be the fix to all your relational problems. Now, last I checked, you are the common denominator in all your relational difficulties. The problem is not going to be fixed by someone else. Eventually, you're going to get tired of that other person just like you got tired of whoever you're with now. And you're going to be tempted then by someone else. I really doubt that sexual experience that you're fantasizing about is going to live up to whatever is in your head. Instead, I'm pretty confident that what your heart really wants, that when your heart is about to stop, you'll be grateful that you gave your heart to one person, and that one person is there to hold your hand until your heart stops beating. And they're not perfect, and you know that, but you also know that you're not perfect either. And they love you with all your scars and all your imperfections and are there to hold your hand as you die, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health, till death do you part. What does your heart really want? You need to have a heart-to-heart with your heart. When it comes to guardrails, the heart of the matter is your heart. Guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. Your heart determines whether you're really happy or not. Your heart is going to determine whether or not you're satisfied or not. And your flesh, your stomach, will never be satisfied. You'll always be hungry again, no matter how much you feed that temptation. So don't feed your flesh. Guard your heart. Let's pray. And thank God for this gift that he's given us of wisdom and discernment. Loving God, give us a moment of clarity today in our lives, a moment of maturity, a moment of wisdom. Reveal to us our true heart's desire and help us to pursue the desires of our hearts, not the temptations of our flesh. Father, as we prepare for communion today, as we prepare to receive the broken bread dipped in juice as a symbol of your broken body and your shed blood, let this meal just be a reminder of your sacrificial love, that we are the desires of your heart. You let your own heart stop so that ours could keep beating. So please fill this bread and juice with your Holy Spirit, so that as we eat it, we would not only fill our stomachs with bread, but we would fill our hearts with your Spirit, with your love. In Jesus' name.